road to Ashwood, the blue lights came out of nowhere. Adrienne Blake's rental car rolled to a stop on the narrow Georgia back road, the engine ticking faintly under the heavy summer air. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't swerving, she wasn't doing anything wrong. Yet the cruiser behind her had followed for the last 2 miles, its headlights burning into her mirror until the flashing lights finally erupted. Adrienne exhaled, her chest tightening. After 27 years in uniform, leading troops through firefights in Afghanistan, negotiating ceasefires in desert war zones, surviving ambushes that should have ended her life, she never imagined the place that would make her most vulnerable was her own hometown. She tapped the gear into park and glanced at the folded gown in the passenger seat. Her niece's graduation gown, the reason she'd come back to Ashwood. This was supposed to be a quiet evening. Pick up the outfit, spend the night with family, and tomorrow cheer in the stands as her niece walked across the stage. Nothing about this moment was supposed to be dangerous, yet danger had a way of finding her. The crunch of boots on gravel broke the silence. 2 officers, one tall and square-jawed, the other lean with sharp eyes, approached on either side. Their hands rested casually but deliberately on their holsters. "License and registration," the tall one barked. Adrienne lowered her window. Her voice stayed calm, trained by years of command. "Officer, may I ask the reason for the stop?" The lean one smirked. "Don't get smart with us. Step out of the vehicle." Adrienne's stomach twisted. She had been in war zones where every second mattered, where hesitation meant death. This wasn't the battlefield, but her instincts screamed the same warning. This was not routine. Slowly, she placed her license and rental papers on the dashboard where both men could see. Her left wrist flicked almost imperceptibly, pressing the edge of her smartwatch. A faint vibration pulsed against her skin. Emergency signal sent. Neither officer noticed. The tall one yanked open the driver's door. "Out! Now!" Adrienne stepped out. She stood tall, her posture perfect, her frame steady. Years of discipline in uniform left their mark. But to them, she wasn't a lieutenant general of the United States Army. To them, she was just another black woman on a lonely back road. "What's in the car?" the lean officer asked. "A graduation gown," Adrienne replied evenly. "I'm here for family. That's all." The tall one circled her slowly, eyes narrowing at the ribbon still pinned on the lapel of her travel jacket. He let out a low laugh. "What's this? Playing dress-up? General Oprah, huh?" The words sliced deep. Adrienne clenched her jaw but said nothing. She had faced worse insults from enemy fighters who never made it home. But this was her country, her soil, her people. And these men mocked service they could never comprehend. "Hands behind your back," the tall one ordered. The cold steel of the cuffs closed around her wrists. For a moment, shame and fury burned hotter than the Georgia sun. A decorated general with 3 tours of combat and 2 presidential commendations, standing in the dirt like a criminal. But Adrienne knew something they did not. The call had already gone through. The Pentagon knew. The system she had helped build, the one designed for emergencies when generals went dark behind enemy lines, was now focused on a quiet Georgia back road. And when Washington moved, it moved fast. The lean officer leaned close, whispering with a sneer. "Thought you'd scare us with those little pins, lady. You're nobody out here." Adrienne turned her head, eyes locking on his, calm, steady, deadly certain. "Then you have no idea who you've just put in. Chains." Back in Washington, inside the Pentagon's Operations Center, an alarm flashed across multiple screens. Emergency signal, Lieutenant General Adrienne Blake, location, Ashwood, Georgia. Analysts scrambled, phones lit up. Within seconds, a chain of calls reached the Secretary of Defense himself. "Sir, General Blake has activated her emergency code. We don't have full details, but it appears to be a detainment by local law enforcement." The secretary froze. Adrienne Blake wasn't just another officer. She was one of the Pentagon's most trusted commanders, a woman whose leadership had turned the tide of battles overseas. If she had sent the signal, something was very wrong. "Get me the governor of Georgia," he ordered. "Now." On the roadside, Adrienne stood tall, her wrists bound, as the officers laughed quietly. They thought they had control. They thought this was just another night. But deep inside the Pentagon, wheels were turning. And in less than an hour, those two officers would realize they hadn't just arrested a woman. They had arrested a storm, the call heard across Washington. The steel cuffs dug into Adrienne Blake's wrists as she stood on the side of the road, the Georgia cicadas buzzing in the heavy evening air. To the two officers, it was just another stop, just another show of authority in a quiet town where they believed their badges gave them absolute power. But to Adrienne, every tick of her smartwatch's pulse carried weight. She knew that thousands of miles away, in a windowless room beneath the Pentagon, someone was reading her name on a red alert screen. She knew that her silence here was not weakness, it was strategy. Years of command had taught her that sometimes the most powerful move was to wait and let the enemy underestimate you. Inside the Pentagon, the operations center was alive with activity. Analysts leaned over glowing monitors, voices colliding as calls rippled outward. The room, usually reserved for global crises, terror plots, foreign troop movements, cyber attacks, was now focused on a single blinking line of text. Lieutenant General Adrienne Blake, emergency signal, active. The Secretary of Defense himself arrived within minutes, his jacket still half-buttoned from the late-night briefing he had just left. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the report. Adrienne Blake was not a woman who panicked. If she pressed that signal, then something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Where is she?" the secretary demanded. "Ashwood, Georgia," an aide replied. "Two local officers have her detained. We don't yet know the pretext." The secretary's jaw tightened. Adrienne Blake was more than just another general. She was one of the few commanders trusted with both combat strategy and diplomatic negotiations. She had saved American lives overseas by making impossible calls under fire. Now she was handcuffed on a back road by two officers who clearly had no idea what they had just stumbled into. "Get me the governor of Georgia," he ordered, "and wake up the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. If a lieutenant general can be dragged off like a petty criminal in her own state, I want answers on my desk within the hour." Meanwhile, back in Ashwood, the two officers were already starting to feel a change in the air. Ray Mitchum, the older of the two, had been with the department for 15 years. He was used to pulling over drivers and watching fear flicker in their eyes. Fear gave him control. But Adrienne's calm, unflinching gaze unsettled him. She didn't look like someone broken by handcuffs. She looked like someone measuring him, as though he was the one who should be afraid. "You think you're tough?" Mitchum muttered, tightening his grip on her arm as he walked her toward the cruiser. "Out here, your stars don't mean a damn thing. You're in Ashwood now. We run this town." Adrienne didn't answer. Her silence was heavier than words, her posture still commanding despite the cuffs. Logan Sharp, the younger officer, leaned against the hood with a smirk, trying to mask his unease. "Ray, she's probably just some wannabe who bought that uniform on eBay. Nobody real drives around here dressed like that." He forced a laugh, but even he could hear the hollowness in it. The truth was, Adrienne's presence carried something neither of them could explain. It wasn't fear, at least not yet, but it was enough to make their confidence wobble. As the officers argued quietly, a black SUV sped down the road, its tinted windows reflecting the fading sun. It pulled into Adrienne's driveway where her family was waiting for her arrival. Her sister Carol stepped out, confused by the flashing lights and the sight of Adrienne in handcuffs. "What is this?" Carol shouted, rushing forward before an officer blocked her path. "Stay back, ma'am," Logan said. "This is official police business." Carol's eyes blazed. "Official? That's my sister. Do you have any idea who she is?" Ray sneered. "Yeah, she's about to be another arrest on the books. You might want to keep quiet unless you want a night in the station, too." Adrienne finally spoke, her voice low but sharp, the kind of tone that could cut through battlefield chaos and silence 100 soldiers. "Carol, call nobody, do nothing. Just watch." Her sister froze, torn between anger and trust. Adrienne's eyes told her everything. This wasn't the end of a fight. This was the beginning. Back in Washington, the Pentagon's lines burned hot. Calls went from the Secretary of Defense to the governor, from the governor to the state police commissioner, and from there down the chain like thunder rolling across a valley. Within 30 minutes, Ashwood, a town that had rarely seen anything larger than a county fair, was about to find itself under a microscope brighter than any it had ever imagined. But the true storm was brewing even deeper. The Pentagon's analysts had already begun pulling background files, digging into Ashwood's law enforcement records, and what they found in those first minutes shocked them. Years of misconduct complaints, hidden case files, and unexplained disappearances buried in small-town paperwork. What began as an unlawful arrest of a decorated general was quickly mutating into something larger, a web of corruption that stretched from Ashwood Sheriff's Office all the way into state contracts and congressional appropriations. The Pentagon did not simply see a traffic stop. They saw an opening. In the silence of the roadside, Adrienne Blake straightened her shoulders despite the cuffs. Her voice, calm but resonant, carried across the space between her and the two officers. Gentlemen, in about 30 minutes you will no longer be officers of the law. You will be suspects in a federal investigation. And when that moment comes, I want you to remember this night, not because of the power you thought you had, but because of the power you never understood. Ray Mitchum opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, his radio crackled. Static. Then a voice, urgent and sharp. Unit 12, hold your position. Federal authorities are en route. Do not move the suspect. Adrienne's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. The storm had arrived faster than even she expected. Storm over Ashwood, the flashing lights from the police cruiser painted the trees in harsh red and blue, but the night air felt heavier than even the Georgia humidity. Lieutenant General Adrienne Blake stood by the roadside, wrists still cuffed, while the two officers shifted nervously. They had begun the evening certain of their authority, but the sudden message on their radio, the order to hold their position because federal authorities were en route, unsettled them in ways neither could conceal. Ray Mitchum's jaw clenched as he stared down the empty road, the gravel crunching under his boots as he paced in frustration. Logan Sharp, though younger and less hard, Ned felt the weight of what they had done pressing against his chest. It was the first time in his short career that he truly doubted whether his badge would protect him. That was the woman standing handcuffed on the roadside. That was the woman Ray Mitchum and Logan Sharp had chosen to mock. And that was the woman whose name, at that very hour, was setting Washington ablaze. In the Pentagon, the operations center was no longer merely humming. It was roaring. The Secretary of Defense leaned over a conference table as maps of Ashwood appeared on digital screens. Analysts pulled up every patrol record from the county, cross-referencing names, times, and complaints that had once been buried in bureaucratic shadows. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff arrived in uniform despite the late hour, his face grim. Adrienne Blake is not just a general, he said firmly. She's the reason a dozen operations overseas never collapsed into chaos. If she's in trouble, this isn't just about her safety, it's about the message it sends. If a black woman wearing 3 stars can be treated like this in her own state, then what does that say to every soldier, every officer, every ally who trusts us? The secretary nodded, his tone clipped and decisive. We don't let this slide. This is no longer a local matter. This is national. Already helicopters had been dispatched from the nearest military base. Black SUVs rolled down highways, their lights off, escorted quietly by state police who had received sudden orders from the governor's office. Ashwood, quiet, sleepy Ashwood, was about to become the epicenter of a confrontation that reached far beyond county lines. Back on the roadside, Adrienne lifted her chin as headlights appeared in the distance. Ray cursed under his breath. Damn feds. What the hell is going on here? He turned to Adrienne, anger mingling with fear. What did you do? Who the hell are you? For the first time that night, Adrienne allowed herself a small smile, the kind of smile that carried no warmth, only certainty. I told you, Shushat, he said, her voice steady. You don't understand the power you've tangled with. You thought I was nobody. You were wrong. The SUV that pulled up was not local law enforcement. The doors swung open and men in dark suits stepped out, their earpieces glinting under the cruiser's flashing lights. Behind them, the unmistakable insignia of military police marked another vehicle. The air itself seemed to change as the weight of federal authority descended upon the roadside. Ray Mitchum's hand twitched toward his belt, but Logan grabbed his arm. Don't, he whispered urgently, but we're in way over our heads. Adrienne said nothing. She didn't need to. The sight of those black vehicles, the sound of military boots hitting gravel, spoke louder than anything she could have said. This was not just a rescue, it was an arrival. It was a reminder that she was never alone, that the network she had built over nearly 3 decades did not abandon its own. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Officers, remove the cuffs from General Blake immediately." Ray opened his mouth to protest, but the agent cut him off with a sharp glance. "Now!" The keys fumbled in his hand, the metal shaking slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. The steel fell away from Adrienne's wrists, and she rubbed them slowly, her composure unbroken. She didn't look at the officers with anger or even with pity. She looked at them the way a commander looks at soldiers who have no idea how badly they've misjudged the battlefield. But even as the Pentagon secured her freedom, Adrienne knew this was only the surface. The investigation had already begun to unearth things the officers themselves might not fully grasp. Files that hinted at drug money funneled through county projects, missing persons reports tied to traffic stops, and even whispers of connections to congressional aides who had funneled campaign contributions through Ashwood. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something much larger. As the agents guided her toward the waiting SUV, Adrienne paused and turned her head slightly toward the 2 officers. Her words were soft, but every syllable cut like glass. "You thought this was about tonight, but what you've done has opened doors you cannot close. And when the truth comes out, it will not just be your careers that end, it will be everything you thought you controlled." The night swallowed her words, but the officers felt them settle like a shadow that would not leave. For the first time, they realized they hadn't simply handcuffed a woman. They had ignited a war they could never win. Shadows beneath Ashwood, the convoy of black SUVs carried Adrienne Blake away from the roadside, but the echoes of that moment lingered. For Ray Mitchum and Logan Sharp, the night was no longer under their control. The arrival of federal agents had stripped away the illusion of authority they once wore so easily. Yet for the Pentagon, this was only the beginning. They had not sent military police and federal agents to Ashwood simply to rescue a general. They had come to uncover why, in a town so small, an officer of Adrienne's stature had been treated like a criminal. In Washington, the operations center had transformed into a command hub dedicated solely to Ashwood. Files long buried in county archives were suddenly pulled into digital clarity, scanned and analyzed by intelligence officers who were more accustomed to dismantling terror networks than investigating small-town police departments. Yet as the data poured in, patterns began to emerge, patterns that were impossible to ignore. A senior analyst leaned across the table, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "Mr. Secretary, this isn't just misconduct, it's systemic. We're looking at traffic stops where vehicles were seized and never logged into evidence. We're seeing fines collected but not recorded in county account. And here's the worst of it. Several missing persons cases that were closed without explanation. All roads lead back to the sheriff's office." The Secretary of Defense leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "How high does it go?" The analyst hesitated. "Sir, some of the funding streams trace back to state contracts. And beyond that, there are campaign contributions flagged as questionable, routed through local businesses here in Ashwood. We're not just talking about dirty cops. We may be looking at a pipeline that reaches into congressional offices." The room fell silent. It was one thing for 2 officers to humiliate a general. It was another for their actions to expose an entire political structure built on corruption. The secretary's gaze sharpened. "Then we move carefully, but we move now. If this rot has been festering, tonight gives us the perfect cover to rip it open." Meanwhile, Adrienne sat quietly in the back of the SUV, her wrist still red from the cuffs, though her dignity remained untouched. She had endured countless missions where the enemy thought they had the upper hand, only to discover too late that her patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. Tonight felt no different. She replayed every moment of the roadside stop in her mind. Not with anger, but with calculation. Every word spoken, every sneer, every laugh, they would all serve as evidence. The agent sitting across from her finally broke the silence. "General Blake, the Pentagon is expanding the scope of this operation. What those officers did to you wasn't random. We're uncovering threads that suggest something much larger. I need to ask, did you suspect corruption here before tonight?" Adrienne's eyes shifted to the passing pine trees outside the window. She thought of Ashwood, the place she had left behind at 18, desperate to escape the suffocating small-town politics that had always thrived in whispers. "I didn't come here expecting to be reminded," she said softly, "but Ashwood has always had shadows. Power here never belonged to the people. It belonged to whoever could choke the loudest. My family lived through it. I thought the uniform would protect me from it. Clearly I was wrong." The agent nodded grimly. "Then maybe tonight was more than an arrest. Maybe it was a trigger. You might have just given us the key to blowing open something that's been buried for decades." Back at the Ashwood police station, the tension was thick enough to suffocate. The sheriff, a broad man named William Bill Cutter, sat behind his desk, staring at the flurry of calls lighting up his phone. His officers whispered nervously in the hallway as word spread that a general had been wrongfully arrested and federal agents were swarming the town. Cutter's face reddened as he slammed the receiver down. "Damn fools," he muttered. "What have you done to us?" Ray Mitchum and Logan Sharp stood stiffly before him, sweat beading along their temples. They had expected a pat on the back for asserting control, for reminding outsiders who really ran Ashwood. Instead, they were facing a storm they never imagined. Cutter's voice thundered across the room. "Do you realize who you cuffed tonight? Do you have any idea what kind of hell you just opened?" Ray tried to defend himself, his voice cracking under the weight of his own fear. "She didn't tell us who she was. She looked suspicious. We were doing our job." "Your job?" Cutter leaned forward, his fists pounding the desk. "Your job was to keep the machine running, not bring Washington to our doorstep. Do you think they won't start digging now? Do you think they won't find what we've been keeping quiet for years?" Logan's stomach twisted. His voice came out a whisper. "Sheriff, what exactly are they going to find?" The silence that followed was heavier than anything either of them expected. Cutter's eyes hardened, and for the first time, and the two officers realized the truth, they had been pawns in something much larger. And now, with a single act of arrogance, they had invited the full weight of the United States military into Ashwood. At that very moment, inside a quiet conference room in Washington, the Secretary of Defense ended a call with the governor of Georgia. The message had been blunt: cooperate or be exposed. The governor, caught between loyalty to state allies and the threat of federal intervention, chose the only path that would save his own career: compliance. Within hours, federal investigators would descend on Ashwood, armed not just with warrants but with authority powerful enough to dismantle an empire of corruption brick by brick. Adrienne Blake closed her eyes as the SUV turned onto the interstate, heading toward a secure military installation. She wasn't smiling, but there was a calm certainty in her expression. She knew this wasn't over. The cuffs had been only the beginning. The real battle wasn't about her dignity. It was about pulling back the curtain on the rot festering in her hometown. And she was ready. For every insult, for every sneer, for every laugh at her expense, there would be a reckoning. And the men who had thought they could reduce her to General Oprah would soon learn that the storm they had unleashed could consume not only their badges, but everything they had ever sworn to protect. The sheriff's last stand. The Ashwood County Sheriff's Office was a crumbling brick building tucked behind the town square, a relic from another era that still carried the smell of dust, coffee, and gun oil. For decades it had been the seat of power in a place where the law was not a shield but a weapon, wielded only by those who knew how to profit from fear. Sheriff William Bill Cutter had sat at the top of that throne for nearly 20 years, his influence stretching far beyond the chipped walls of his office. Contracts flowed through him, elections bent around him, and silence was bought at a price. He had always believed the machine he built was untouchable, its gears greased with bribes, intimidation, and carefully buried files. But tonight, for the first time, Cutter felt the weight of something he could not control pressing against his chest. He slammed a folder shut and lit a cigarette, pacing the length of his office. Outside, he could hear the whispers of his deputies, men who once carried themselves like enforcers but now shuffled nervously as federal SUVs prowled the streets of Ashwood. The presence of outsiders in dark suits, their eyes sharp and their questions relentless, was a storm no one in the department had prepared for. Cutter knew the younger officers were already wondering if loyalty was worth the price. He had seen that look before, the look of men calculating how to save their own skins. The door opened without a knock. Ray Mitchum and Logan Sharp stepped inside, their faces pale, their postures stiff. They had been summoned, and though neither admitted it out loud, both felt like men walking into their own sentencing. Cutter looked at them, smoke curling from the cigarette clutched in his thick fingers. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the anger of a man who realized the ground beneath him was cracking. "You two don't understand what you've done," he growled. "Arresting her was one thing, stupid, reckless, but survivable. What you did tonight wasn't just slap cuffs on a black woman in uniform. You slapped cuffs on a war hero, a general with direct lines to the Pentagon. Do you know what that means? They're not here to clear her name. They're here to dig. And once they dig, boys, they're going to find everything." Ray shifted uncomfortably, his pride still forcing him to hold his head high. "We didn't know who she was, Sheriff. She didn't say." Cutter barked a bitter laugh. "Ignorance doesn't save you when the house collapses, and you've just kicked out the foundation." Before either man could respond, the sound of engines rumbled outside. Through the blinds, Cutter caught the sight of more SUVs pulling up, headlights cutting across the cracked pavement. Federal investigators were not waiting, they were descending. The sheriff's office, once a fortress, now looked like a sinking ship surrounded by predators. Cutter stubbed out his cigarette and leaned over his desk, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Listen to me carefully. You keep your mouth shut. You don't talk to anyone without me in the room. And if they come asking about files, you don't know a thing, understand?" Logan nodded quickly, but Ray hesitated, his jaw tightening. Cutter noticed it immediately, and his eyes narrowed. "Don't even think about growing a conscience now. You've been part of this machine too long to play innocent." Before the argument could deepen, the office door swung open again. The figure that stepped inside brought the entire room to silence. Adrienne Blake stood tall, her uniform crisp, her presence commanding, flanked by two federal agents. Though her wrists were still red from the earlier cuffs, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had walked into war zones and never once faltered. Her eyes scanned the room, settling on Sheriff Cutter. "General Blake," Cutter said with forced civility, his lips curling around her rank like a curse. "I hear Washington wasted no time sending in their cavalry. What a spectacle. Ashwood's never seen this kind of fuss." Adrienne didn't sit. She remained standing, her gaze steady and unflinching. What Ashwood has seen is corruption masquerading as law enforcement. Tonight wasn't just about me. Tonight was about exposing how deep the rot goes in this town. Cutter leaned back in his chair, feigning calm, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "Big words from someone who doesn't live here anymore. You think you understand Ashwood? This place runs on deals, not ideals. Men like me keep the wheels turning. Without us, this town falls apart." Adrienne stepped closer, her voice low but cutting through the room with razor clarity. "No, Sheriff. Men like you are the reason towns like this never rise. You choke them with your greed, your fear, your corruption. You don't keep Ashwood alive. You keep it chained." The deputies outside could hear her voice, and whispers spread quickly down the hall. For years, Cutter's authority had been absolute, his words the final law. But in a single confrontation, Adrienne was planting seeds of doubt in the very men who upheld his power. The federal agent beside her placed a thick folder on the sheriff's desk. "Sheriff Cutter, these are warrants. We now have legal authority to seize your files, your accounts, and your communications. Every missing report, every closed case, every suspicious transfer is about to see daylight." Cutter's face darkened, his hands curling into fists. "You think you can just walk in here and tear apart everything I've built?" Adrienne met his glare with unwavering resolve. "I don't think, Sheriff. I know." The weight of her words pressed down on the room like a storm front. For the first time in decades, William Cutter realized he was not the predator, he was the prey, and standing before him was the woman he had underestimated, the same woman his officers had mocked and humiliated only hours earlier. Except now, she wasn't standing alone. She had the full force of Washington at her back. The cigarette smoke still hung in the air, but the atmosphere in the sheriff's office had shifted permanently. Cutter could feel it in the way his deputies no longer met his eyes, in the way Ray's silence carried guilt rather than loyalty, and in the way Adrienne Blake's presence seemed to strip the very walls of their power. Outside, as federal agents carried boxes of files into SUVs, Ashwood began to tremble. The secrets buried in this town were no longer safe, and Sheriff William Cutter knew that his last stand had already begun, and that he might not survive it. The web unravels. The raid on the Ashwood Sheriff's Office was only the first ripple of what was quickly becoming a national storm. By dawn, the small town that had always woken to the lazy hum of trucks and church bells instead found its streets buzzing with unfamiliar engines. Federal SUVs lined the courthouse square, helicopters circled at a distance, and reporters, smelling a story too large to ignore, had begun to descend. For the people of Ashwood, this was a spectacle they had never imagined. For Sheriff William Cutter, it was the beginning of the end. In Washington, the Pentagon's operations center remained lit through the night, its walls alive with screens, maps, and streams of intelligence. What began as a rescue for a decorated general had evolved into a sprawling investigation. Federal analysts combed through files seized from the sheriff's office, cross-referencing bank transfers, property records, and campaign contributions. At first, it appeared to be a web of local graft, traffic fines pocketed, contracts awarded to shell companies, deputies paid off to silence inconvenient voices. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something far more dangerous. Lines of money and influence stretching far beyond Georgia. One name led to another. A construction company tied to Ashwood's infrastructure projects was discovered to have funneled donations into a political action committee supporting a sitting congressman. That same PAC had distributed funds into multiple campaigns, masking them as grassroots contributions. A pattern emerged, unmistakable and damning. The corruption did not end at Ashwood's borders. It fed into a machine of influence that reached the state capitol and climbed further still, winding its way toward the halls of Congress. The Secretary of Defense reviewed the evidence with cold fury. "This is no longer just a scandal," he said to the assembled officials. "This is a cancer. And it started here in a town that thought no one would notice. Now, thanks to one mistake, thanks to Adrienne Blake, it's exposed." Meanwhile, Adrienne herself had refused to retreat into silence. At the secure military installation where she had been taken after her release, she stood in a briefing room facing rows of officials, investigators, and military officers. Her wrists were still sore from the cuffs, but her voice carried with the authority of a commander who had led men into battle and returned with victory. "They thought I was powerless because of the color of my skin," she said evenly. "They thought the stars on my shoulders were just decoration, but this is bigger than me. Ashwood is not an isolated injustice. It is a symptom. How many others have been silenced? How many families buried by corruption, their voices erased because no one in power thought to listen? If we let this go unanswered, then what do we tell every soldier who believes in the count they serve? What do we tell every citizen who trusts the law to protect them?" Her words were not a speech rehearsed for politics. They were the truth, drawn from the marrow of a life lived in service and sacrifice. And for the men and women listening, they landed with the weight of conviction. Federal investigators who had spent years buried in files and numbers now looked at Adrienne and understood the human cost of the corruption they uncovered. This was not just about money or influence. It was about dignity, trust, and the soul of American democracy. Back in Ashwood, Sheriff Cutter fought desperately to hold on to the crumbling walls of his empire. He stormed through the station, barking orders, demanding loyalty, insisting that the federal agents had no right to dismantle his office. Yet the fear in his deputies' eyes betrayed the truth. His grip had been broken. Men who once followed his word without hesitation now whispered in corners, weighing whether it was better to protect him or protect themselves. Loyalty, after all, was a currency that evaporated quickly when careers and prison sentences hung in the balance. Ray Mitchum, his pride shattered, found himself cornered by two investigators who laid out the evidence of his own misconduct, illegal stops, falsified reports, intimidation. They offered him a choice: speak or fall with Cutter. For the first time, Ray realized the badge that once gave him power now hung like a noose around his neck. Logan Sharp, younger and less entrenched, had already begun to crack, his silence splintering into confessions that poured out in bursts of fear. Cutter knew the dam was breaking. He sat alone in his office late that night, the blinds drawn, his desk scattered with half-empty glasses and crumpled papers. His empire, once so carefully managed, was being dismantled piece by piece, and at the center of it all was Adrienne Blake, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had underestimated, the woman who now stood as the symbol of everything he could not defeat. But Cutter was not a man to go quietly. His pride, his anger, and his desperation twisted together into a single dangerous thought. If he was going to fall, he would take others with him. He began making calls, reaching out to allies who still owed him favors, to men who sat higher than him on the ladder of power. "If I go down," he muttered into the phone, "your names go with me." What Cutter did not know was that the very calls he made were already being traced. Federal surveillance, authorized by emergency warrants, recorded every threat, every bargain, every plea. The web he thought he could use to protect himself was the same web tightening around his throat. By the following morning, news outlets were ablaze. Headlines screamed of corruption uncovered in Georgia, of a general wrongfully detained, of investigations that now reached into congressional offices. Adrienne Blake's name, once spoken mockingly by two officers on a dark road, now appeared in every broadcast as the woman whose courage had pulled the first thread in unraveling an empire of deceit. And yet, Adrienne knew the battle was not over. Standing on the steps of the military installation, watching helicopters lift into the pale morning sky, she felt the storm gathering strength. The fight was no longer about her arrest. It was about dismantling a system that had thrived in shadows for too long. And she was ready, because for every shadow Ashwood had cast, she carried the light of truth and the determination to burn through the darkness, no matter how high it reached. The reckoning. The nation woke to headlines that felt ripped from a political thriller. For weeks, the airwaves had been saturated with chaos abroad, debates in Congress, and the usual noise of partisan squabbles. But now, every screen, every newspaper, every voice on talk radio was consumed with one story: the wrongful arrest of Lieutenant General Adrienne Blake and the Pandora's box it had opened. What began on a lonely Georgia road had become a scandal that reached into the very heart of American democracy. The hearings in Washington were unlike anything seen in years. Senators who normally thrived on grandstanding sat silent as evidence was laid out with surgical precision. Boxes of seized documents from the Ashwood Sheriff's Office became the foundation of a chain of corruption that wound upward through state officials, lobbyists, and finally into the offices of sitting congressmen. The testimony of former deputies once loyal to Sheriff Cutter painted a picture of a town suffocated by fear, where traffic stops funded elections and silence was enforced through intimidation. Each new revelation struck like a hammer, shaking the public's trust, but also igniting a hunger for accountability. At the center of it all sat Adrienne Blake. Though she had not sought the spotlight, the nation demanded her voice. She appeared before the congressional panel in her uniform, her posture perfect, her tone unwavering. She spoke not with anger but with clarity, recounting the night she was cuffed on the roadside, mocked and dismissed, treated as less than the service she had given. Yet she did not linger on personal humiliation. Instead, she spoke of the broader lesson: that power unchecked, no matter how small it seemed, could metastasize into something that threatened the very foundations of democracy. The fight for freedom, she told the chamber, her voice resonating across the silence, does not only happen overseas. Sometimes the most dangerous battles for our nation's soul are fought at home, on back roads where badges are abused, in offices where files are buried, and in towns where silence is bought. We cannot claim to defend liberty abroad if we allow corruption to fester within our borders. Justice Shushta. Tice is not a uniform we wear only when convenient. It is a duty that must live in every corner of this country. While Washington convulsed, Ashwood itself underwent a transformation. Sheriff Cutter, once the untouchable king of the county, was led out of his office in handcuffs before a sea of cameras, his face pale and drawn, his arrogance crumbling into bitter silence. His deputies scattered, some facing charges, others clinging to plea deals, all stripped of the power they had once wielded carelessly. The town square, once dominated by the sheriff's swagger, now bore witness to federal agents cataloging files and citizens, watching in stunned silence as the myth of untouchability shattered before their eyes. But for Adrienne, the most powerful moment came not in a congressional chamber or a courthouse, but back where it had all begun, her family's home in Ashwood. After weeks of hearings, investigations, and relentless scrutiny, she returned quietly without cameras to the house where her mother's flowers still bloomed in the garden and where her sister waited on the porch. The weight of the nation's battle fell away as she stepped inside to find her niece, dressed in her graduation gown, standing proudly with tears in her eyes. "Auntie," the young woman whispered, her voice trembling with pride, "they said you changed everything." Adrienne knelt, her hands resting gently on her niece's shoulders, her eyes shining not with pride for herself, but for the future she saw in the girl's face. "No," she said softly, "we changed everything. Every person who stood up, who refused to be silent, who demanded better. We did this together. Remember that. Because the fight doesn't end with me. It begins with you." That night, under the Georgia stars, Adrienne sat with her family on the porch, the cicadas buzzing just as they had on the night of her arrest. Yet the air felt different now. The fear that once haunted those back roads had been broken. In its place was something fragile but undeniable: hope. For the rest of the nation, the story of Adrienne Blake was immortalized not only in headlines and hearings, but in a broader understanding of justice. It was the reminder that power is not permanent, that corruption cannot thrive forever in darkness, and that sometimes it takes one person's humiliation to awaken the conscience of millions. For Adrienne, however, the meaning was simpler. She had faced enemies across the world, but this battle, fought on the soil of her own hometown, had proven the hardest. Yet it had also proven that dignity, once tested, can become the sharpest weapon of all. And so, when the last lights of the day faded and the town settled into silence, she allowed herself a rare smile. Not of triumph, not of vengeance, but of quiet certainty. Because she knew that the road which had once humiliated her would forever be remembered as the place where corruption fell, and where a general stood unbroken,